When Ethan moved into his new home on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood, he didn't expect much excitement. He had chosen the area for its peaceful streets and friendly neighbors, but the house next door stood out immediately. The yard was unkempt, the windows always shuttered, and the fence separating their properties was tall and weathered. It gave off an air of abandonment, until Ethan noticed movement. The first time Ethan saw his neighbor, it was around midnight. He'd been taking out the trash when he spotted a shadowy figure standing just beyond the fence. The figure didn't move or speak, just stood there, watching. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the still night. The figure didn't respond but stepped back into the shadows, disappearing entirely. Ethan chalked it up to his imagination. After all, moving was stressful, and the late-night chores had probably made him jumpy. But over the following nights, the sightings became more frequent. Ethan would glance out his kitchen window and see the figure standing just beyond the fence, always watching. His curiosity eventually got the better of him. During the day, Ethan decided to introduce himself. The house next door appeared abandoned. No car in the driveway, no signs of life. The mailbox was stuffed with old letters, and weeds had overtaken the flower beds. Ethan knocked on the door, but no one answered. That night, Ethan woke to the sound of something tapping against his bedroom window. Groggy and disoriented, he pulled back the curtain and froze. The shadowy figure was there, standing just outside the window. Ethan's heart pounded as he fumbled for his phone to call the police. But when he looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint impression of muddy footprints in the flower bed beneath the window. The police arrived shortly after, but their investigation turned up nothing. They advised Ethan to install security cameras and keep his doors locked. Taking their advice, Ethan set up cameras around the property, hoping to catch whoever was stalking him. For a few nights, everything seemed normal. Ethan started to believe that the presence of cameras had scared the intruder away, until he reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing unusual. A stray cat here, a passing car there. But then, around 3 a.m., the figure appeared again. They climbed over the fence with unsettling ease and stood in Ethan's backyard, staring directly into one of the cameras. The intruder's face was obscured by a hood, but their posture was unnerving, rigid and unmoving. They remained like that for nearly an hour before retreating back over the fence. Ethan showed the footage to the police, but there wasn't enough to identify the person. Frustrated and scared, he decided to confront his neighbor during the day. When he knocked this time, the door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" Ethan called out, stepping cautiously inside. The house was eerily silent, and the air smelled stale. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was as though no one had lived there for decades. But then Ethan saw it, a pile of photographs scattered across a coffee table. The photos were of him. There were pictures of Ethan mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, sitting on his porch. Some were recent, while others dated back to before he'd even moved in. Ethan's stomach churned as he backed out of the house, his heart racing. He called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the house had been emptied. The photos, the furniture, everything was gone. Over the next few weeks, Ethan tried to move on, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sightings of the figure stopped, but strange things began happening instead. He'd wake up to find his car doors unlocked or the back gate open. Once, he found a single photograph slipped under his front door, a picture of his bedroom window, taken from outside. Desperate, Ethan hired a private investigator to look into the history of the house next door. What he found was chilling. The house had belonged to a man named Walter King, a recluse with a history of mental illness. Walter had disappeared years ago after being accused of stalking several neighbors, but his body was never found. The investigator also discovered that the property had never been sold. Officially, it was still abandoned. Ethan didn't know what to believe, but the incident stopped shortly after. The house next door remained empty, and the figure never returned. To this day, Ethan doesn't know who or what was watching him, but he never feels entirely safe, especially at night. Every now and then, he'll hear the faint sound of tapping at his window, and he can't help but wonder if Walter King is still out there, watching from the shadows. When Mia and her husband, James, bought their dream home in a quiet cul-de-sac, they were thrilled to finally settle down. The neighborhood was quaint, filled with friendly families and retirees who waved hello on their morning walks. Everything seemed perfect, except for the house directly across the street. It was unremarkable at first glance, a single-story home with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. But the most unsettling thing about it was the old, rusted car parked in the driveway. The car was a faded blue sedan with a smashed front bumper and a spiderweb of cracks across the windshield. It never moved. No one ever got in or out. Mia first noticed the car's strangeness on moving day. It was hot, and the movers were struggling to get the couch through the front door when Mia glanced across the street. A man stood in the window of the house, partially obscured by the curtain. He didn't wave or smile. He just watched. "Looks like you've got a welcoming committee," James joked when Mia pointed him out. Mia laughed it off, but the man's gaze unsettled her. Weeks passed, and the car never budged. Mia kept an eye on the house, curious about the neighbor who lived there. She rarely saw the man outside, and when she did, he was always heading to the backyard or carrying groceries into the house. The car remained untouched. One day, Mia decided to introduce herself. She walked across the street and knocked on the door, a plate of cookies in hand. The man answered after a long pause. He was older, with thinning hair and tired eyes. "Hi, I'm Mia. I just moved in across the street," she said cheerfully. The man stared at her for an uncomfortably long moment before muttering, "Welcome to the neighborhood," and closing the door without taking the cookies. The encounter left Mia with more questions than answers. She couldn't understand why someone would leave a car like that sitting in their driveway for years. Her curiosity turned to suspicion when strange things started happening. Late one night, Mia was woken by the sound of an engine idling. She peered through her bedroom window and froze. The blue sedan was running. Its headlights illuminated the driveway, but no one was in the driver's seat. Mia nudged James awake, but by the time he looked, the car was off again. "You're probably just imagining things," he said groggily, but Mia knew what she'd seen. The next morning, she crossed the street to inspect the car. The tires were flat, and rust had eaten through the body in several places. There was no way it had been driven recently. Determined to get answers, Mia decided to ask one of the neighbors about the man and his car. She approached an elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan who lived next door. "Oh, that's Harold," Mrs. Callahan said when Mia brought it up. "He's been here forever, but he's not the friendly type. Keeps to himself mostly." "And the car?" Mia asked. Mrs. Callahan's expression darkened. "That car belonged to his son. He died in an accident years ago. Harold's never gotten rid of it." Mia felt a pang of sympathy for Harold, but couldn't shake her unease. The car didn't just feel like a grieving father's keepsake. It felt wrong. Her suspicions deepened when she began noticing scratches on her car in the mornings. Small, deliberate marks that hadn't been there the night before. At first, Mia thought it might be teenagers in the neighborhood, but then she saw it. One night, unable to sleep, she peeked through the curtains and spotted Harold standing in her driveway. He was dragging something sharp along the side of her car. Mia grabbed her phone to call the police, but when she looked back, Harold was gone. The next day, she confronted him. "I saw you last night," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Why are you scratching my car?" Harold looked at her with a blank expression. "It wasn't me." "Then who was it?" Harold hesitated before muttering, "The car." Mia didn't know how to respond. She stormed back across the street, convinced Harold was trying to scare her. But things only got stranger. One evening, Mia and James returned home to find the blue sedan parked in their driveway. "How did it get here?" James asked, baffled. "I don't know," Mia whispered. The car looked exactly as it always had, rusted, broken, and abandoned. But the thought of Harold pushing it across the street seemed absurd. They called the police, who towed the car back to Harold's property. Harold said nothing when questioned, only repeating that the car moved on its own. Mia and James installed security cameras to catch Harold in the act, but the footage only deepened the mystery. One night, the cameras recorded the car slowly rolling out of Harold's driveway and crossing the street. There was no one inside. Terrified, Mia and James decided to move. They put the house on the market and avoided Harold's property as much as possible. On their final night in the house, Mia looked out the window one last time. The blue sedan was back in Harold's driveway, its headlights on, and in the glow of the headlights, she swore she saw a figure sitting in the driver's seat, watching her. Mia never looked back after they moved, but she couldn't escape the feeling that the car wasn't done with her. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up to the faint sound of an engine idling outside her new home, but when she looked, the street was always empty. I've always loved the quiet of rural living. My husband, Daniel, and I had bought a small, cozy farmhouse on the edge of a sleepy little town. We were looking forward to the slower pace of life, surrounded by open fields and a few friendly neighbors. The house wasn't perfect. It was old, the floors creaked, and it had its share of quirks, but it had charm. It didn't take long for us to settle in, though we occasionally heard strange noises. At first, we chalked it up to the house settling or wildlife outside. But one night in late January, everything changed. That evening, Daniel and I were watching a movie when we heard it. A loud, deliberate banging on the front door. We froze. It was after midnight, and our closest neighbor was half a mile away. Daniel paused the movie and got up to check. I stayed behind, clutching a pillow tightly. "Who's there?" Daniel called out, but no one responded. He opened the door cautiously, and the cold night air rushed in. There was no one outside, just the empty front porch and the vast darkness beyond. "Probably just kids playing pranks," Daniel said, closing the door. But something about the sound unsettled me. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate. The banging continued sporadically over the next few nights, always around the same time. Each time Daniel checked, there was no one there. We started double-checking that all the doors were locked before bed, but the noise persisted. One night, I decided to stay awake and see if I could catch whoever was doing it. I sat by the window in the living room, lights off, staring at the front porch. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the banging started again. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw a figure standing on the porch. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by a hood. "Daniel," I whispered urgently, but by the time he came running, the man was gone. We reviewed the footage from the security camera we'd installed above the door, but it didn't make sense. The camera showed the man walking up to the porch, banging on the door, and then disappearing. Not walking away, not running, just vanishing into thin air. We reported the incidents to the local police, who agreed to patrol the area at night. But the banging continued, even when the officers were nearby. They found no signs of anyone lurking around. It was affecting our sleep and our sanity. Daniel suggested it might be the wind, but I knew better. One night, when the banging started, I mustered the courage to open the door myself. Nothing, but as I stepped outside, I noticed something on the porch, scratches in the wood, as if someone had been clawing at it. A week later, Daniel decided to confront the issue head-on. He stayed up with me, armed with a baseball bat. At the first knock, he yanked the door open and stepped outside. I followed him hesitantly, scanning the porch and yard. The banging had stopped, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. "Show yourself," Daniel shouted into the darkness. A faint rustling came from the bushes near the side of the house. Daniel approached cautiously, but before he could get close, a figure darted out and ran into the fields. We gave chase, but the person was too fast. They disappeared into the night, leaving us shaken and no closer to answers. The next day, we found a new detail that made my stomach drop. Scratched into the wood of the porch were the words, "Let me in." The police increased their patrols, but their presence seemed to agitate the intruder. One night, the banging grew louder and more frantic. It wasn't just the front door. It was every window, every wall. It sounded like dozens of hands pounding against the house. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to move. Daniel called the police, but the banging stopped as soon as the dispatcher answered. When the officers arrived, they found nothing but the fresh scratches on the walls. Desperate for answers, we started asking around the town. A local shopkeeper named Helen finally gave us some insight. "That house used to belong to the Wainwright family," she said. "They lived there for generations, but they were a strange bunch. kept to themselves. Helen explained that the last Wainwright, a man named Edward, had disappeared about 15 years ago. He was known for being reclusive and eccentric, and rumors swirled about dark rituals he practiced on the property. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting us was tied to Edward Wainwright. I began researching his life, poring over old newspaper articles and local archives. I learned that Edward had been suspected of involvement in several disappearances in the area, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. His disappearance remained a mystery. One article mentioned that Edward often spoke of protecting the house from intruders, though no one knew what he meant. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that Edward, or whatever was left of him, was behind the disturbances. One night, as the banging resumed, I stood by the door and shouted, "Edward, what do you want?" The banging stopped immediately. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. I don't know if Edward heard me or if my words meant anything to whatever force was tormenting us. But from that night on, the banging stopped. We moved out of the house a few months later, unable to shake the memories of those terrifying nights. To this day, I wonder if Edward Wainwright is still watching over that house, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in. When Lila and her partner Mark moved into their new duplex, they were thrilled. The rental was affordable, the neighborhood was quiet, and it was close to their jobs. The duplex was divided into 2 units, one upstairs and one downstairs. They took the lower unit, while the upper unit was occupied by a man named Carl. Carl was polite but distant. He was in his 60s, tall and wiry, with a weathered face that rarely showed emotion. When they introduced themselves, he nodded curtly and said, "Let me know if you need anything." That was the extent of their interaction. At first, everything seemed fine. Carl was a quiet neighbor who kept to himself. But then Lila started noticing a strange smell in their apartment. It wasn't constant, but when it appeared, it was overwhelming, pungent and earthy, with a metallic tang. The smell seemed to come from the vents, wafting in at odd times. Lila brought it up to Mark, who dismissed it as probably being from the old building. "Maybe Carl's cooking something weird," he suggested with a shrug. But Lila wasn't convinced. The smell didn't remind her of food. It reminded her of something rotting. One evening, as they were watching TV, the smell grew so strong that Lila had to leave the room. Mark finally agreed to check the basement, where the building's utilities were located. The basement was accessible from an outdoor stairwell behind the duplex. Lila watched nervously as Mark descended into the dimly lit space, flashlight in hand. "What's down there?" she called out. "Nothing unusual," Mark replied after a few minutes. "Just old pipes and a bunch of junk. It smells musty, but nothing terrible." Lila felt uneasy, but let it go for the time being. Over the next few weeks, the smell came and went. Lila tried to ignore it, but she started noticing other strange things about Carl. He never seemed to leave the duplex during the day. His car remained parked in the driveway, and his windows were always covered with thick curtains. One night, Lila was taking out the trash when she saw Carl in the backyard. He was digging a hole near the fence, a large garbage bag lying next to him. "What are you doing?" she asked, startled. Carl looked up, his face expressionless. "Gardening," he said flatly before turning back to his work. The next morning, Lila checked the spot where Carl had been digging. There was no sign of a garden, just a patch of freshly turned soil. When she told Mark about it, he brushed it off. Maybe he changed his mind and filled it back in, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, the smell returned, worse than ever. Lila decided to investigate the basement herself. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and tools. The smell was strongest near a locked door at the far end of the room. Lila pressed her ear against the door but heard nothing. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Just as she was about to leave, she heard footsteps above her. Carl was walking through his apartment. The floorboards creaked loudly, and she froze, afraid he'd come down and find her snooping. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She told Mark about the locked door and begged him to come with her to check it out. "You're being paranoid," he said, but he agreed to help her. The next evening, while Carl was out, they went back to the basement. Mark brought a crowbar to pry open the door. Inside, they found what looked like a storage room. The smell hit them like a wave, so strong that Lila gagged. At first, they didn't see anything unusual, but then Lila's flashlight landed on a large chest in the corner. Mark hesitated before opening it. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Lila nodded, her heart pounding. Inside the chest were several garbage bags. Mark pulled one open, and they both recoiled in horror. The bag was filled with animal carcasses, rabbits, squirrels, and other small creatures. Some were fresh, while others were in advanced stages of decay. "What the hell is this?" Mark whispered, his face pale. They backed out of the room and locked the door behind them. Lila wanted to call the police, but Mark convinced her to wait. "We don't know the full story," he said. "Let's talk to Carl first." The next day, they confronted him. "What's in the basement, Carl?" Lila asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Carl stared at her for a long moment before answering. "You shouldn't have gone down there." His tone was calm, but his words sent a chill down her spine. That night, Lila woke to the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom window. She shook Mark awake, and they both listened in silence. The footsteps moved around the house, stopping near the back door. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and went to investigate, but by the time he got outside, whoever it was had disappeared. The next morning, they found scratches on the back door, as if someone had been trying to break in. They called the police, who searched the basement and interviewed Carl. He admitted to storing the animal carcasses, but claimed they were for taxidermy projects. The police couldn't find any evidence of illegal activity and left without pressing charges. But Lila and Mark didn't feel safe. They started noticing Carl watching them from his window, his expression unreadable. The final straw came a week later, when Lila found a dead rabbit on their doorstep. Its body was mutilated, and its blood had been used to write the word "leave" on the front door. They packed their things that night and moved out the next day. Months later, Lila heard from one of her former neighbors that Carl had been arrested for trespassing on another property. The neighbor also mentioned that more animal remains had been found buried in his backyard. To this day, Lila can't drive past the old duplex without feeling a knot of fear in her stomach. She doesn't know what Carl's true intentions were, but she's glad she and Mark got out before they found out. When Rachel and her fiancé Eric moved into their cozy apartment building, they thought they'd found the perfect place. Located in a quiet neighborhood, the building was old but charming, with only 6 units and a communal courtyard where the tenants occasionally mingled. Most of their neighbors were polite but kept to themselves, except for the man in Unit 4. His name was Robert, though everyone called him Bob. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with unkempt gray hair and a hunched posture. Bob rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. Rachel and Eric thought he was harmless at first. "Just a quiet guy," Eric would say. But there was something about Bob that made Rachel uneasy. Her first unsettling interaction with Bob happened one evening when she was doing laundry in the basement. She was pulling clothes out of the dryer when she heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the dimly lit room. Bob appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "You shouldn't leave the door unlocked," he said quietly, staring at her. Rachel forced a polite smile. "Thanks, I'll remember that." Bob didn't move. He just stood there, watching her as she gathered her clothes and hurried back upstairs. Over the following weeks, Rachel began noticing odd things around the building. Doors would be left slightly ajar, even though she and Eric were meticulous about locking up. She'd find her mail torn open in the communal mailbox, though nothing was ever missing. Once, she spotted Bob standing in the courtyard, staring up at her apartment window. When he noticed her looking, he shuffled away without a word. Eric brushed off her concerns. "He's just lonely," he said. "I'm sure he doesn't mean any harm." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Bob was watching them. One night, Eric was working late, and Rachel was home alone. She was reading in bed when she heard a soft tapping at the window. Her heart raced as she crept over to the curtains and peeked outside. The courtyard below was empty, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. She convinced herself it was just the wind and went back to bed, but the tapping continued. This time, it was coming from the front door. Rachel grabbed her phone and tiptoed to the peephole. There was no one there. Her hands trembled as she double-checked the locks and called Eric, who promised to be home as soon as he could. When he arrived, they found nothing unusual. "You're just stressed," Eric said, wrapping an arm around her. "Maybe you should talk to someone." Rachel wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next day, she decided to talk to one of her neighbors, an older woman named Carol who lived in Unit 2. "Oh, Bob's been here forever," Carol said when Rachel brought him up. "He's harmless, but a bit odd. Keeps to himself mostly. Why do you ask?" Rachel hesitated before telling Carol about the strange noises and her uneasy feelings. Carol frowned. "You know, now that you mention it, I've noticed him hanging around the basement a lot. And there was that time I found him in the laundry room, just sitting there in the dark. Gave me quite a scare." That evening, Rachel and Eric decided to install a security camera inside their apartment, facing the front door. It gave Rachel a sense of control, though she wasn't sure what she expected to catch. 2 nights later, she found out. The camera recorded a figure standing outside their door in the middle of the night. It was Bob. At first, he just stood there, staring at the door. Then he reached out and tried the handle. When it didn't budge, he pulled something from his pocket, a small tool of some kind, and began fiddling with the lock. Rachel's blood ran cold as she watched the footage. Eric immediately called the building manager, who confronted Bob the next day. Bob denied everything, claiming he'd been asleep in his apartment all night. Without concrete proof, there wasn't much the manager could do. Rachel and Eric decided to be cautious, but didn't feel like moving just yet. They hoped the confrontation would deter Bob from any further behavior. But things only escalated. One evening, Rachel returned home to find their front door unlocked. She stepped inside cautiously, calling out for Eric, but the apartment was empty. Her heart sank when she saw the small pile of mail on the coffee table. It wasn't theirs. It was Bob's. Terrified, Rachel called Eric, who rushed home from work. Together, they decided to check the security footage. The video showed Bob entering their apartment with a key. He wandered through the rooms, touching their belongings and mumbling to himself. At one point, he stood in their bedroom, staring at the bed for several minutes. Rachel was shaking by the time the video ended. They called the police, who arrived quickly and questioned Bob. He admitted to having a spare key, which he claimed was given to him by the previous tenant. The police confiscated the key and warned Bob to stay away from Rachel and Eric. But Rachel still didn't feel safe. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Eric began making plans to move. They avoided Bob as much as possible, but the tension in the building was palpable. One night, as they were packing, the power went out. "Probably just the breaker," Eric said, grabbing a flashlight. He headed to the basement to check, leaving Rachel alone in the apartment. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eric didn't come back. Rachel's anxiety grew as she called out his name, but there was no response. She grabbed her phone and hurried to the basement, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found Eric lying unconscious on the floor. Standing over him was Bob. "Stay back," Rachel screamed, her voice echoing in the dark. Bob turned to her, his face twisted in an expression she couldn't read. Anger, sadness, or something else entirely. "I was just trying to help," he mumbled, backing away slowly. Rachel called the police, who arrived just in time to detain Bob. It turned out Bob had cut the power to lure them into the basement. His motives were never fully explained, but the police found unsettling items in his apartment: photos of Rachel and Eric, a collection of stolen keys, and a detailed journal documenting their daily routines. Rachel and Eric moved out the next day. To this day, Rachel can't shake the memory of Bob's face or the sound of his voice in the basement. She and Eric have since found a new home, but the experience has left them wary of their neighbors. Every creak, every knock, every unfamiliar face is a reminder of the quiet man in Unit 4 who watched them from the shadows.